A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century, by Barbara W. Tuchman. Picture yourself standing on a dock in Sicily in 1347. The harbor buzzes with the usual chaos of trade, merchants shouting, sailors hauling cargo, the mingled smells of fish and spices hanging in the air. But today, something feels wrong. A fleet of trading ships drifts into port, their sails hanging limp, an unnatural silence hovering over the decks. As they drift closer, your stomach turns. The men at the oars are slumped over, dead or dying, their bodies covered in grotesque black swellings that ooze blood and pus. These sailors have journeyed from the east, and they've brought back something far more terrible than any cargo. They've brought the apocalypse. This terrifying scene marked Europe's first encounter with the Black Death, a plague that would eventually claim roughly 1/3 of everyone living between India and Iceland. It was a catastrophe so massive that even today, we struggle to wrap our minds around it. But here's the thing, this single nightmare was just one movement in a whole symphony of chaos. The 14th century was packed with so much violence, upheaval, and sheer disaster that it makes our current problems look almost manageable by comparison. That's the journey we're embarking on today with Barbara W. Tuchman's masterpiece, A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century. This isn't your typical dry history textbook. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning work of storytelling that's kept millions of readers riveted since it first hit the shelves. Tuchman started with a deceptively simple question: what happens to a society when it gets hit by the most lethal disaster in recorded history? Her quest for answers led her deep into a century ravaged by not just one, but 7 major catastrophes: plague, war, crushing taxation, roaming bandits, corrupt government, popular revolts, and a devastating split right down the middle of the church. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you'll understand more than just what happened during this calamitous century. You'll grasp why Tuchman called it a distant mirror to our own time. You'll see how societies crack under extreme pressure, how institutions we assume are rock solid can crumble like sandcastles, and how ordinary people, with all their foolishness, bravery, and greed, somehow manage to carry on. Tuchman gives us a guide through this dark landscape, a French nobleman named Enguerrand de Coucy, whose life from birth to death spans the century's worst trials. Through his eyes, we'll witness the collapse of an entire civilization. So let's step back 600 years into a world that's both shockingly alien and disturbingly familiar. To really grasp the chaos of the 14th century, you need to understand the world it was leaving behind. Imagine a society built like a pyramid with God sitting firmly at the top. Below him were 3 distinct layers, or estates. First came the clergy, those who prayed for everyone's souls. At the bottom was the 3rd estate, the commoners, the vast majority who worked the land and labored in towns so everyone else could eat. And sandwiched in the middle was the 2nd estate, the nobility, the knights, whose sacred job was to fight and protect the other 2. This was the golden age of chivalry, an ideal of honor, courage, and Christian duty that supposedly governed the entire noble class. At the heart of this world stood France, considered the ultimate example of chivalry, learning, and faith. The French king was called the most Christian king. French knights were the most admired warriors in the world, and the University of Paris was basically the intellectual center of Europe. And nowhere was the power and pride of this noble class more visible than in the great baronies scattered across the realm. Picture a massive fortress perched on a hilltop in northern France, a monument that could either guard the king or challenge him. This was the Castle of Coucy, home to a dynasty so proud and ambitious that their family motto practically shouted their independence. I am not king, nor prince, nor duke, nor count. I am the Lord of Coucy. The castle itself was a monument to power. Its central tower, the donjon, was the largest in all of Europe, 180 feet high, with walls 30 feet thick, capable of sheltering 1,000 men during a siege. It was built during the same creative explosion that gave us France's magnificent cathedrals, and it belonged to Enguerrand de Coucy VII, the man who'll be our guide through this story. His life, from his birth in 1340 to his death in 1397, lined up perfectly with the century's deepest crises. But the world he was born into, this seemingly rock-solid world of knights and castles, was already starting to shake. A strange chill had settled over the land at the century's start. The Baltic Sea actually froze over twice. Unseasonable cold, brutal storms, and devastating floods led to crop failures and a catastrophic famine from 1315 to 1317. This famine got so bad that rumors spread of people eating their own children and the desperate poor cutting down bodies from the gallows to eat. The foundations of society were developing serious cracks. The Church, which was supposed to be the great unifying force of the age, was in crisis mode. In a shocking display of royal power trumping papal authority, the King of France actually sent his agents to physically assault Pope Boniface VIII. The Pope died from the shock and humiliation, and shortly after, the entire papacy got moved from Rome to Avignon in southern France. For the next 70 years, the popes would all be French, living in what many called a Babylonian exile. This Avignon papacy became the poster child for church corruption. The popes, supposedly successors to the poor fishermen of Galilee, now lived like royalty in a massive palace fortress, surrounded by luxury that would make modern CEOs blush. To finance their lavish lifestyle, they turned the church into a massive money-making machine. Everything had a price tag: church positions, pardons for sins, special exemptions from rules. Want to marry your cousin? There's a fee for that. Need your illegitimate child legitimized? That'll cost you. The selling of salvation became a booming business. This corruption trickled down through every level. Bishops who bought their positions passed the costs down to local priests. And on the street level, ordinary people encountered the church mainly through pardoners, characters Chaucer would later immortalize, who peddled absolution for any sin from gluttony to murder, selling counterfeit salvation to a fearful and gullible public. Meanwhile, the knights were also failing spectacularly at their sacred duty. The ideal of chivalry was all about protecting the weak, upholding justice, and defending the faith. But in reality, the warrior class had become the oppressors. Their private wars devastated the countryside. Their constant need for money led them to squeeze their peasants dry, and in a world where royal power was growing stronger, their actual function was becoming more about flashy displays than real protection. They poured their energy into tournaments, magnificent and violent spectacles that were more about personal glory and potential profit than actual military preparation. The gap between the ideal of chivalry and the reality of knightly behavior had become a massive chasm. This was the fraying world into which Enguerrand de Coucy was born, a world of deep contradictions where a church that preached poverty wallowed in wealth, and knights sworn to protect the weak preyed on them instead. And into this already troubled world, two massive calamities were about to strike. One was man-made, the other came from nature itself. The first was the 100 Years' War. It started, as so many wars do, over land and a disputed claim to a throne. The King of England, Edward III, controlled a huge chunk of southwestern France called Aquitaine, but he held it as a vassal to the French king. This was an unbearable situation for both sides. The French kings wanted their land back, while the English kings wanted complete sovereignty. In 1337, war finally erupted, and Edward dusted off an old claim to the French throne itself through his mother, a French princess. At first, the matchup seemed laughably one-sided. France was the dominant power in Europe, with 5 times England's population and a military reputation that was second to none. But England had a secret weapon, a revolutionary piece of technology that would completely change warfare: the longbow. The longbow was beautifully simple but deadly effective. 6 feet long and made of yew, it could fire arrows with terrifying speed and accuracy. A skilled longbowman could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, compared to a crossbowman's measly 2. At 200 yards, its iron-tipped arrows could punch right through armor. The French knights, encased in their heavy plate armor and bound by a code that prized individual combat above everything else, absolutely despised missile weapons. To them, real warfare was about personal combat, about proving your courage face to face. They viewed archers as cowards who wouldn't dare fight up close. It was a fatal mistake. The first major test came at the Battle of Crecy in 1346. King Edward's army, having plundered its way through Normandy, found itself cornered by a much larger French force. The English took up a defensive position on a hillside, with their knights dismounted and their longbowmen arranged in deadly formations on the flanks. What happened next was a disaster born of pure French arrogance. The French knights, desperate for glory, refused to wait for their own crossbowmen to soften up the English lines first. They charged uphill in chaotic waves, straight into a storm of English arrows. The bowstrings hummed, and thousands of arrows rained down like a dark cloud. Horses screamed and collapsed, throwing their riders. Knights in heavy armor, unable to get back up from the mud, were finished off on the ground by Welshmen with long knives. The flower of French chivalry was systematically cut down. It was a devastating blow not just to an army but to an entire social order. The idea that a peasant with a bow could defeat a nobleman on his warhorse was supposed to be impossible, and it shook medieval society to its foundations. Enguerrand de Coucy's own father was killed around this time, making the 7-year-old boy the new Lord of Coucy. But an even greater disaster was already on its way. In October 1347, those Genoese ships arrived in Sicily. The Black Death had reached Europe. It spread with terrifying speed, carried by fleas on black rats that hitched rides in the holds of merchant ships. By January 1348, it had reached France. It moved along the coasts and up the rivers, arriving in Paris by summer. The disease came in two nightmarish forms. The first, bubonic plague, caused the infamous black swellings called buboes in the armpits and groin. It spread by contact and killed its victims within 5 days. The second form, pneumonic plague, infected the lungs and was even more vicious. It spread through the air when people breathed or coughed, and it could kill in 3 days or less, sometimes in just 24 hours. There was no known way to prevent it and absolutely no cure. The entire fabric of society disintegrated. Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another. One chronicler wrote, "Doctors refused to see the sick, priests wouldn't administer last rites, people died alone, and their bodies were left rotting in the streets." In the cities, where the plague hit hardest, workers dug massive burial pits and piled corpses in layers. In Avignon, the Pope actually consecrated the Rhone River so bodies could just be thrown into it. People genuinely believed they were witnessing the end of the world. The death toll was absolutely staggering. Modern historians estimate that in roughly 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, about a third of Europe's population perished. That's approximately 20 million people. In some places, the toll was even worse. Florence lost up to 4/5 of its population. Entire villages were completely wiped out, their fields returning to wilderness. Nobody understood what was causing it. They blamed everything, from a bad alignment of the planets to earthquakes releasing poisonous gases from deep in the earth, but most commonly they saw it as the wrath of God. And if the plague was divine punishment, then surely there must be some human agent to blame. The scapegoat, as so often in history, turned out to be the Jews. Wild accusations spread that Jews were poisoning wells in a massive conspiracy to destroy Christianity. A wave of horrific persecutions followed. From Spain to Germany, Jewish communities were rounded up and burned alive. In Strasbourg, before the plague had even reached the city, 2,000 Jews were taken to the cemetery and massacred. The Pope issued official statements declaring the Jews innocent and pointing out that they were dying of plague just like Christians, but his voice was drowned out by the hysteria. The plague also spawned the flagellants, groups of religious extremists who marched from town to town whipping themselves with iron-spiked scourges until they bled. They believed that by recreating Christ's suffering on their own bodies, they could atone for humanity's sins and turn away God's wrath. At first people revered them, but they soon grew arrogant, claiming they could forgive sins themselves. They became a revolutionary, anti-clerical movement, inciting attacks on both priests and Jews before the Church finally suppressed them. Enguerrand de Coucy, now an orphan after his mother died in a later outbreak, was just 9 years old when the first wave passed. He grew up in a world hollowed out by death, a landscape of shrunken populations and haunted villages. The Black Death had flipped the social pyramid upside down. With labor suddenly scarce, the value of land plummeted, while wages soared. Peasants and craftsmen suddenly found themselves with real bargaining power. They demanded higher wages and refused to perform their old feudal obligations. The landowners, the nobility, were in crisis. They tried to force wages down through laws like England's Statute of Laborers, but the economic tide was against them. The old bonds of feudalism were snapping. And the war with France dragged on. In 1356, 10 years after Crécy, the two sides clashed again at Poitiers. This time, the French were led by their king himself, Jean II, a man whose rashness and military incompetence suggested he'd learned absolutely nothing from the earlier disaster. The French again had overwhelming numbers. The English, led by Edward's son, the Black Prince, were cornered, exhausted, and weighed down with plunder from a long raid. The Black Prince was so sure of defeat that he offered to give up all his prisoners and loot and promised not to fight France for 7 years. But King Jean, drunk on his numerical advantage, demanded that the prince and 100 of his knights surrender themselves as prisoners. The prince refused, and battle was joined. The French managed to repeat the mistakes of Crécy with almost suicidal precision. Their initial cavalry charge was shattered by English longbowmen. Then, in a bizarre tactical decision, the main body of French knights actually dismounted to attack on foot. Weighed down by their heavy armor, they advanced slowly across the field. Their formations fell apart, their leaders were killed or captured, and one entire battalion, commanded by the king's own brother, fled the field without striking a single blow. King Jean himself fought with incredible courage, his youngest son, just 14 years old, standing at his side. But he was surrounded, his helmet knocked off, bleeding from wounds to his face. "Yield, or you're a dead man," voices shouted around him. And so the King of France was captured right there on the battlefield. The defeat at Poitiers was even more crushing than Crécy. It was a national humiliation. It wasn't just the king who was lost, but the entire prestige of the French nobility. They'd failed again at their one essential job, to fight and protect the kingdom. When the nobles returned to their estates to raise money for their ransoms, the common people greeted them with scorn and hatred. Cries of "Traitor!" echoed through the land. How else could France's mighty army of chivalry be defeated by a handful of archers and bandits, except through betrayal? France was now a kingdom without a king, defeated, leaderless, and descending into chaos. The Dauphin, the young heir to the throne, was a sickly and inexperienced teenager. The treasury was empty. Into this power vacuum stepped the merchants and leaders of Paris, led by a man named Etienne Marcel. They saw their chance to seize control from a discredited monarchy and impose a new order. They demanded reforms, the dismissal of corrupt royal advisors, and a real share of power for the common people. For a while they actually succeeded. The Dauphin was forced to accept their demands, but Marcel, in his struggle with the crown, allied himself with a dangerous and unstable character, Charles of Navarre, a rival claimant to the throne known as Charles the Bad. And Marcel made an even more fatal choice. He supported the most terrifying uprising of the century, the Jacquerie. In May of 1358, the pent-up rage of the French peasantry finally exploded. For centuries, they'd been the bent-backed Atlas of the medieval world, supporting the other two estates on their shoulders while being scorned by nobles and exploited by everyone. Now, pushed to the breaking point by the ravages of war, by the marauding bands of unemployed soldiers called the free companies, and by crushing taxes demanded by lords to pay their ransoms, they rose up. It started in a village near Paris when a group of peasants, after a meeting in the cemetery, declared that the nobles had shamed and ruined the realm, and that it would be a good thing to destroy them all. They stormed the nearest manor, killed the knight and his family, and burned the place to the ground. The revolt spread like wildfire. Within weeks, thousands of peasants armed with farm tools were on a rampage, attacking castles, murdering lords, and committing unspeakable atrocities. A wave of terror swept through the noble class. They saw the Jacques not just as rebels, but as an existential threat, bent on annihilating their entire order. Guillaume Caille, a charismatic peasant with some military experience, emerged as their leader. He tried to forge alliances with the towns, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a real revolution of common people against nobles might actually succeed. But the Jacquerie was too brutal, too chaotic. Etienne Marcel's support for them cost him the backing of the propertied classes in Paris. The turning point came at Meaux, where a band of Jacques besieged a fortress holding several hundred noble ladies. They were rescued by a group of knights who slaughtered the peasants, like animals. After that, the suppression was merciless. Charles of Navarre, reading the room, led the nobles' counterattack. Guillaume Caille was captured through treachery and executed. And young Enguerrand de Coucy, now 18, made his first mark on history. He gathered a force of gentlemen and hunted down the remaining Jacques, quote, without pity or mercy, completing their extermination. The Jacquerie was crushed within a month. In Paris, Etienne Marcel, increasingly isolated and radical, was assassinated by his own citizens, who then opened the gates to the Dauphin. The bourgeois revolution was over. But France remained a broken country. The king was still a prisoner in England. The free companies continued roaming the land like a plague of locusts that the government was powerless to stop. And the church, which should have been a source of comfort and stability, was about to inflict on Christendom its deepest wound yet, the Great Schism. In 1377, after 70 years in Avignon, Pope Gregory XI finally brought the papacy back to Rome, much to the horror of his French cardinals, who'd gotten comfortable with the luxuries and political safety of their French home. When Gregory died the following year, the people of Rome, terrified that another French pope would be elected and drag the papacy back to Avignon, surrounded the Vatican, howling, "We want a Roman! A Roman!" Fearing for their lives, the cardinals elected an Italian, the Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. He was known for being humble and competent, but the moment the papal crown touched his head, he transformed into an arrogant, abusive, and possibly insane tyrant. He insulted the cardinals, threatened them, and tried to strip them of their wealth and privileges. The French cardinals were horrified. They'd elected a master who'd turned into a monster. They fled from Rome and declared that Urban's election was invalid because it had been made under duress. Then, in September 1378, they elected one of their own as Pope, Robert of Geneva, a man known throughout Italy as the Butcher of Cesena for his role in a horrific massacre. He took the name Clement VII. And just like that, there were two popes. The Great Schism of the West had begun, and it would tear Christendom apart for 40 years. Every nation in Europe had to pick a side. France, naturally, backed the French Pope in Avignon. England, just as naturally, sided with the Italian Pope in Rome because he was France's Pope's enemy. The conflict divided kingdoms, universities, and even religious orders right down the middle. Each pope excommunicated the other and all his followers. Every Christian in Europe was now, in the eyes of one pope or the other, a heretic, living under threat of eternal damnation. The schism was a spiritual catastrophe, and it completed the century's work of destruction. It seemed like every institution that gave life meaning and order had failed. The nobility had failed to protect the people. The monarchy had failed to govern. And now the church, the very house of God, was a house divided, ruled by two grasping and hostile rivals. In the midst of this decay, Enguerrand de Coucy walked a difficult tightrope. He'd married Isabella, the eldest daughter of England's King Edward III, a match that made him son-in-law to his own country's enemy. For years he maintained a precarious double loyalty, refusing to fight for either side. But as the war reignited, he was forced to choose. He renounced his English titles and lands, sent his wife back to England, and declared himself a good and true Frenchman. He became one of the most trusted and capable figures at the French court, a skilled diplomat and experienced commander. He fought campaigns in Italy, led an army of mercenaries into Switzerland, and in 1390 commanded a crusade against Barbary pirates in North Africa. The world he moved through was one of extravagant, almost desperate splendor, as if the ruling class were trying to cover their society's decay with a golden blanket. It was an age of outrageous fashions, pointed shoes so long they had to be tied to the knee, and magnificent tournaments and banquets where pies were served with live birds hidden inside. But beneath all the glitter, the shadows kept growing longer. The King of France, Charles VI, the boy who'd succeeded his wise father, was prone to fits of madness. His first attack came in 1392 when, on a scorching summer day, he suddenly drew his sword and, screaming, "Treason!" charged his own men, killing several before he was subdued. For the rest of his long reign, he would slip in and out of sanity, leaving the kingdom a playground for the ambitions of his greedy and warring relatives. It seemed like the century was doomed to end in darkness. The plagues kept returning, the wars dragged on endlessly, the schism festered. A deep pessimism settled over Europe like a fog. It found its ultimate expression in the danse macabre, the dance of death, a new and morbid art form that appeared during this period. In murals painted on cemetery walls, a skeletal figure of death leads a procession of mortals from every rank of life. Pope, emperor, knight, peasant, child, all dancing toward their common grave. The message was crystal clear. Power, honor, and riches mean nothing. In the end, death levels everyone. And it was to death that the century's last great enterprise was dedicated, the final crusade. By the 1390s, the Ottoman Turks, who'd crossed into Europe 50 years earlier, had conquered most of the Balkans and were now at Hungary's borders. Their advance threatened the very heart of Christendom. A call went out for a great crusade to drive them back. The response from France was overwhelming. The knightly class, sitting idle since the latest truce with England, was eager for a new adventure, a fresh chance to win honor and glory. The Duke of Burgundy sponsored the expedition, putting his 24-year-old son, Jean de Nevers, in nominal command. But the real leader, the chief counselor everyone looked to for experience and wisdom, was Enguerrand de Coucy. In 1396, the Crusader army, a glittering host of French chivalry, set out. Their numbers swelled with Hungarians, Germans, and Knights Hospitallers. Their plan was audacious. After driving the Turks from the Balkans, they'd march on to Constantinople, cross into Asia, and liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Their confidence was absolute, their arrogance unlimited. They believed themselves invincible. They ignored the cautious advice of their Hungarian allies to wait and let the Turks come to them. Instead, they plunged deep into enemy territory, laying siege to the Turkish fortress of Nicopolis on the Danube. There, in September 1396, Sultan Bajazet, known as the Thunderbolt for his lightning-fast movements, fell upon them. The French insisted on leading the charge, brushing aside the Hungarian king's sound tactical plan. "We are the vanguard," the Constable of France cried. "To take the rear would dishonor us." Believing they faced only the Turkish advance guard, they charged uphill in their heavy armor, straight into a trap. They broke through the first line of untrained Turkish conscripts, then through a line of infantry protected by sharpened stakes. Exhausted and overheated, they crested the hill expecting to find the remnants of a defeated army. Instead, they came face to face with the elite Turkish cavalry, the Sipahis, fresh and ready for battle. What followed was a slaughter. The French were surrounded and cut down. The lion in them turned to timid hare, one chronicler wrote. Admiral de Vienne, the eldest knight, was killed, trying to rally them, the banner of Our Lady still clutched in his hand. Coucy fought with tremendous strength, but it was hopeless. The Crusaders were overwhelmed. The defeat was followed by something even more horrific. Enraged by his own heavy losses, and by discovering that the Crusaders had massacred their Turkish prisoners before the battle, Bajazet ordered a mass execution. The captured Crusaders, thousands of them, were stripped naked and marched before the Sultan. There, Jean de Nevers, Enguerrand de Coucy, and the other great lords who'd been set aside for ransom were forced to stand and watch as their companions were beheaded one by one, from morning until late afternoon. The crusade had ended in a catastrophe far worse than Crécy or Poitiers. It was the final, bloody testament to the complete failure of chivalry. Enguerrand de Coucy, the man who'd survived all the century's other disasters, didn't survive this one. He died in a Turkish prison in Broussa a few months later, in February 1397, before his ransom could be arranged. His heart was embalmed and sent back to France, a final, melancholy relic of a shattered age. His life had been a perfect mirror of his time. He was born into the pride of chivalry and died in its ruin. He'd witnessed the peak of the medieval world and its calamitous fall. His story and the story of his century is a profound and sobering lesson about the cycles of history, the fragility of order, and the enduring, often tragic, nature of humanity. When you finish a book like A Distant Mirror, the first thing that hits you is its weight. Not the physical weight of the book, but the emotional and intellectual weight of having lived through such an age of relentless disaster. Barbara Tuchman's genius isn't just in chronicling events, but in making you feel the texture of the time, the anxiety, the superstition, those brief flashes of beauty and heroism in an ocean of darkness. She chose her title with incredible precision. The 14th century isn't just a collection of historical facts, it's a reflection of our own anxieties. When we read about a society grappling with a mysterious and deadly pandemic, where established institutions like government and the church are losing their authority and the trust of the people, it's impossible not to feel that shiver of recognition. One of the most powerful lessons from this book is about the illusion of permanence. The people of the 14th century believed their world was ordained by God, that its structures were eternal. The three estates, the universal church, the code of chivalry, these weren't just traditions, they were the pillars of reality itself. And then, in the space of a single lifetime, they all started crumbling. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed an entire way of thinking. It shattered the belief in a just and ordered universe under a benevolent God. It showed that the systems people relied on for protection and salvation could fail utterly and catastrophically. This brings us to another crucial lesson, the danger of refusing to adapt. The French knights at Crécy, Poitiers, and Nicopolis are a perfect, tragic example. They were undeniably brave, no question about that, but their bravery was trapped inside a rigid code of honor that had become completely detached from reality. They clung to the glorious individual cavalry charge in an age when the longbow had made it obsolete. They valued personal glory over coherent strategy. They refused to learn from their mistakes, so they repeated them again and again, with devastating results. Their story is a timeless warning about clinging to outdated ideas when the world is changing around you. But this isn't just a story of collapse. It's also a story of resilience. In the midst of chaos, you can see the first stirrings of a new world. You see it in peasants demanding their freedom, in the merchants of Paris trying to create constitutional government, in thinkers like Wycliffe challenging church authority and calling for religion in language people could actually understand. These movements were almost all crushed in their own time, but they planted seeds that would eventually grow into the Renaissance and the Reformation, The 14th century, in its agony, was giving birth to the modern world. So what can we take away from this journey into a dark and distant past? First, perspective. As turbulent as our own times might feel, humanity has weathered worse storms. We've faced collapse, and we've rebuilt. Second, caution. The story of the 14th century shows how quickly things can unravel when institutions lose their moral authority and leaders indulge in foolishness and self-interest. It reminds us that the structures of our society aren't as permanent as we might think. They require constant care, reform, and the courage to adapt. And finally, profound empathy for the people who lived through that time. They weren't just characters in a history book. They were real people who loved and feared and hoped and suffered, just like we do. Their world was torn apart, but they endured. And in their story, in this distant mirror, we can, if we look closely enough, see a reflection of ourselves. That was a summary of A Distant Mirror by Barbara W. Tuchman. We've touched on the major themes and stories today, but a summary, no matter how detailed, is only a map. The real treasure is in the journey itself. The magic of this book is in Tuchman's incredible prose, the way she makes you feel the mud of the battlefield, or the terror in a plague-stricken city. This summary is here to show you what the book holds and help you decide if it's a journey you want to take. If anything we've discussed has sparked your curiosity, I genuinely encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an experience that will change the way you see the past, and maybe, just maybe, the way you see the present. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if this journey through history has given you a new perspective, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to Billionaire's Bookshelf. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another book that has the power to shape how we think. Let's keep discovering these timeless lessons together.